This is a rice paddy in Korea, and you can see the hills behind me, and the trees and the ridges, and this is the type of terrain that the Canadians fought over in Korea. At the end of 1951, the character of the Korean War changed completely. It went from open warfare to static warfare, a war of entrenched positions and massed artillery support, but it was no less bloody. For the Canadians who served here in 1952 and 53, the Korean War was a war of waiting, watching, and patrolling.
We were going down into the valley. We were almost there, and we saw these shadows coming up at us. Lieutenant Sykes turned to me and he whispered, "There's 3 Chinese just ran across the path." It was like walking into a wall, where you think you're gonna maybe get hit with something any moment. You're as afraid as you'll ever be in your life, because you think this is maybe death coming in the next couple of seconds.
We're driving out of Seoul north towards the demilitarized zone, and what's clear in Korea is that they're still on a war footing. You can see barbed wire entanglements all along the river, there's guard posts, and you can see gun emplacements and bunkers all over the place. In military terms, Seoul is a very vulnerable city. It's only about 30 to 40 kilometers from North Korea, and therefore it could be hit by all sorts of weaponry. And it's sort of a strange contrast to see all this military equipment and fortifications living side by side with such a vibrant city. So we're still on the highway north of Seoul, but we're getting closer to the junction of the Han and the Imjin rivers, which means that the communists are about a kilometer away across the river. So you see a lot more military positions. And just over there, you'll see an embedded tank. And I'm not going to point to it because I don't think they'd appreciate us filming them. But you can just look over my shoulder, and this is an example of what we're going to see from here on up to the DMZ. This is another example of military preparations in South Korea, and this is a tank block. You can see that it looks like an overpass, but in fact, it's got 2 columns. And in the event of a North Korean attack, they would blow the columns and this giant slab of concrete would come right down. And of course, this would block the road, stopping all North Korean armor. We're now passing through the restricted zone, which is a higher level of military preparedness. And then we're going to go up into the militarized zone itself. And the area we're interested in are the hills that were captured by the Canadians in 51 and held through 1952 and 53. And what's remarkable is the South Koreans today are using exactly the same positions, the same locations as the Canadians held back in the Korean War. And it's amazing to me that the line has not moved forward in more than 50 years. Since the fall of 1951, all along the UN front, the Korean War has devolved into a stalemate. Hundreds of thousands of men on both sides dig in, fortify positions, and prepare for a different kind of war. In October 1952, 3 Canadian battalions are holding frontline positions north of the Samichon River. And as they did almost a year before, Canadian troops once again move into positions on the strategically important Hill 355. The war had gone quite quiet in 1952. There had been very few major Chinese attacks on the Canadian positions. Even by October, for 10 months, everything had gone quite well. Casualties had mounted. There's patrolling and mortar shells, always some action. It wasn't until 3 weeks into October that the next major action took place. This is the infamous Hill 355. The honor of holding this position went to the Royal Canadian Regiment, and on about the 17th of October, they started to notice a lot more communist artillery fire and mortar fire coming in on their positions, and particularly ranging their positions, which is always a bad sign. The Chinese always used infiltration techniques, so they would try to find a weak point, and then of course they would plan it in advance. These attacks are very well planned. Both sides know the peace negotiations are going on, and I don't think either side wanted to risk too much. And this was true of the Chinese. Gone were the days of the massive attacks across minefields. Now they were far more concerned about the preservation of their own lives. But they would determine where the weak points were, and they would often work at night even to remove mines and make pass-through minefields or cut barbed wire to try to get in. In this situation, the Chinese had infiltrated around the position and even dug advanced bunkers as jump-off positions so that they could move very quickly. The UN controlled the air, and they also had an advantage in artillery, so whatever the Chinese did, it had to be quick. So they had to get into your position right away. So they'd move up as many men as they could, maybe 100, 200 men into these positions, and once the artillery fire ended for them, they're through the wire.
I got halfway up the trench, and we had Chinese coming over the wall. Somebody started to fire, and I picked up fire with my Sten gun. Emptied that off. Then we just tossed them over the side of the trench.
Hundreds of Chinese attacked the Canadians with the intent of killing as many as possible. They overrun the forward platoons. Now the Canadians have no choice but to bring down artillery on their own positions. All along these hills, the artillery, the tanks, the mortars, everything is letting loose on the Chinese. So about 1 a.m. in the morning on the 23rd, the RCRs go back to their position and the artillery has done its job. And they've cleared out the Chinese. They made their point. They wanted to inflict some pain on the Canadians, and they had moved out. The Chinese raid on Hill 355 cost the 1st RCRs 35 wounded and 18 men killed. The costliest battle for the Canadians to date in Korea. The battle that took place on Hill 355 in October 1952 was a bloody nose for the Royal Canadian Regiment. But an attack on such a position should have been expected. 355 is the most important position in this sector, and the communists would dearly love to have a piece of it. Every sector had their own special piece, special linchpin. And within a month, the Canadians would get a taste of another infamous piece of the line, and it was called the hook. One of the problems with the Korean War is that the battles were all fought in a tight area of ridges and ravines that I can't tell apart. And it's very difficult going from a map from 1950 to be absolutely positive you got the right positions. The other thing is that there's only limited access to a lot of these positions because most of them are in the DMZ or very close to it. So with the cooperation of the South Korean Army, we're going to try to get into there and see what we can find on what was known as the old hook positions.
Okay. 지금 출발하세요. 우리 10명입니다.
Where is he going? Where is he going? I'm not sure.
It's a little difficult to try to establish from the old maps onto the new maps to make sure we end up in the same right place. This is a very complicated area. The terrain is very difficult. There's lots of ridges and bumps, and it's very hard to read. So now we've got to make sure we're going to go to the right place.
Oh, they don't have a no-P position here? So you're going to bring it here. That's the closest they can bring us.
Okay.
Okay?
So this we're gonna get up. This the closest we can get is the what is marked as the B Company position here. But at the same time, we should get a really clear view across the Sammamish River Valley to see the other Canadian positions towards Hill 355. So it'll be quite interesting to see what we can see from here. Most of the battlefields of the Canadians in Korea are in the demilitarized zone. So we're going into what is really a battle zone. And we're going to be escorted by a patrol of South Korean soldiers all the way up. And I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be interesting. We've got an escort with us. And we're going right into the DMZ, into the GP post that's close to the hook. So we're gonna have to stop filming in a couple seconds because we're getting close to one of the defensive positions. So we're going to be going up to the top of the hill, which is, of course, it's going to be the outpost, or the GP they call it here, which is in the middle of the demilitarized zone. It also was a Canadian battlefield. So we're going to try and find the hook positions as closely as we can. So from there, we'll be able to see the North Korean positions of today, as well as the Communist Chinese positions of 1951-52. So it's sort of going back in time a little bit, but the tension is still there. I just wonder how long this can go on for.
여기서 요쪽을 배경으로 찍으시면 됩니다. 여기, 요쪽. 저쪽은 안 되고 저기가 적 지피거든요.
That's the North Korean post over there?
That is the enemy post.
This point, so we're here, yeah, 248, and that's
Okay.
that's 132 is that right there.
Now here is North Korea zone.
Yeah.
We can't go there.
Oh yeah, or one way.
Right.
Here is called HID hill. HID hill. Do you know HID?
HID? No.
HID is a special forces of South Korean to infiltrate to North Korea. You know the noise, the explosion?
Yes.
Just before you heard? That is the noise of mine explosion. The animal.
Oh, an animal's gone on the mine.
Yeah. Press the mine, so mine brought up.
Okay. It's good to know it's not.
Yeah.
조심해야 됩니다. 그래서 길이 아닌 곳은 절대 다니지 않고 있어요, 우리도.
So you have to be very careful not to go the minefield because there is only road sign. There is a triangle
The red
sign.
triangles.
Red triangles saying
Yeah.
the minefield. So you don't have to. You shouldn't go there.
요게 그 연천평야하고
이게 3.2천.
삼이천.
Sammamish River.
예,
Yeah.
삼이천.
So we're looking over here.
Yeah.
예, 이게 잘못됐어. Wrong. This line is wrong.
Yeah, this is old. This is from
아, okay. Now
1952.
here.
Up here. Okay,
Yeah.
right at 355. Okay, now that makes sense.
Okay.
It's hard when you use the old maps. See? In the winter of 1952, the Hook was the UN's most important position in the sector west of the Sammamish River. Consequently, it received special attention from the Chinese, who were only 300 yards away and within easy striking distance. The men defending the Hook had to be constantly on guard, watching for signs of an impending communist attack. This position was very, very important because if they could take the hook, they could literally outflank some of the other positions, which you can see off to the right, which is all down the line here, which is where the Canadians were for most of the Korean War. And so it was always very important that this position be held. But the battle we're interested in is the one that took place in November 1952, which is the first action of the 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's. The hook was held by the Black Watch, the Royal Highlanders, and they were very fortunate to be the men who were in support of them. So they're actually in these little valleys over here. They had 2 companies, and the companies were in consecutive order. So if anything went wrong, they would move up into varying positions. And what happened on the night of the 18th and 19th November, the Chinese put down a lot of artillery fire and cut the position off. And of course, they went after the Warsaw position, which was the lead one. For the Patricias, they had to come up through these little valleys, move up into position, and then launch the attack to help recapture the position.
It takes a long time to draw close to the hook. The great explosions are unending. Just above my head, I know the air is filled with jagged, searing shrapnel. We come on 2 sandbag bunkers. There's a huge mound of earth to our left, dumped by high explosive shells. A Scout's booted feet jut grotesquely from its center. We move forward, tread on bodies in the bottom of the trench. I'm scared now. The reality of battle death came the instant I saw the bodies of the Scouts.
To their credit, they came up through here, and by the time they had arrived, another unit of the Black Watch had recaptured the position, so they were able to drive off the communists. But you can see from here as well, you get a really nice view of the communist positions, and they're much closer here. This river valley is much more narrow than this Samichon. And of course, after that position, until 53, early 53, the Canadians patrolled this position and went out into the lines and ran into a few problems there. But when they knocked the communists back in November, it sort of calmed them down a little bit. But this area of the Samichon Valley was where all the patrols used to go out. And it's also where the Canadians suffered most of their casualties during the Korean War. For example, I would say, out of the 400 or so that were killed, 350, 370 were killed in this area along here. This is where the Canadians took all their casualties. All along the Samichon, throughout 1952 and 1953, the static war grinds on. And as the peace talks drag at Panmunjom, life for the men in the line becomes routine, often tedious, but always dangerous, with death never very far away. We are on the road north of Seoul, approaching the DMZ. We're going up to Hill 187, which was a battlefield for many of the Canadians who fought in Korea. During the Korean War, Canadian troops served overseas for a 12-month period, and then they would be rotated out and new troops would come in. And one of the soldiers in the 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, was Terry Maher. And Terry, can you explain how you decided to come to Korea?
I, like a lot of the fellows at the time, grew up with a lot of heroes in our towns and villages from the Second World War. And there was a certain amount of romanticism in me, as it was with a lot of the volunteers that came over here.
So when you landed in South Korea, you started to make your way up?
We went up in what is called the Pusan Express, and it's an old steam engine, and the cars all close together, and small seats built for Orientals, and I'm over 6 feet. The train was surrounded by Korean kids, and they were always saying Shushan Joe, 25 cents a pack of cigarettes and so forth. We felt quite sorry for them, and we gave them what we had. The train started to pull out, and the little kids put the rocks to the train, and they were, some of the rocks were coming through the window, and so we were ducking down as the train pulled out.
So now we're on the route up the Hill 187. It's now an established position for the South Korean Army. Same locations as you guys chose. We'll be able to get a clear view of the old no man's land, which is still the no man's land.
Right.
The Chinese positions, everything, except now it's North Koreans. So much hasn't changed.
I hope I recognize it because I was over all of it and all over all of the valleys. I think I spent most of last night thinking about dead people.
So Terry, do you recognize this place?
What I recognize quite well or impressed with just looking at it is the hills, the Chinese hills in the foreground, how they fold up and higher, and they get darker and darker as they go into the background. I always thought it was quite foreboding. Chinese hills were right across the valley, and I always thought they were 300 or 400 yards from the front. From the sharp end positions where Charlie Company was. We'd be in the front line anywhere from 30 days to 2 months. On Hill 187 here, I was on here for, I think, 58 days. There was no civilization up here, and there was a person lived on his wits and his reputation. There was a natural leadership that took over up here. The most dominant thing was the fear of the Chinese, and the second thing, almost as bad, was the cold, and it dominated everybody's existence. And there was always you got a wind here now. There was always a cold wind coming from the north, and it would cut through, and you couldn't put your parkas up because you couldn't hear the shells coming in. Sitting in your slit trenches here, and in other positions too, they would have a loudspeaker would come from across the valley over there, and somewhere back of 166. And it would start off with very sentimental music. It would be American music or Canadian music, and very, very sentimental. And it would be always a woman's voice singing to you.
It always hurts to say goodbye. Why do we try to hide the pain in our hearts?
They always called us Americans, and say they would start off American officer, American soldier. This is not your war. You should go home now. Why are you fighting over here and suffering like this when a rich capitalist is having turkey dinner with your wife? And you'd get that for a couple of hours, and then after a while the artillery would start to fire salvos over there, and then it would stop. At midnight, we'd pick up our food, and you'd go one or two at a time because you didn't want people bunching up around it because of shells coming in. The meals consisted of often macaroni, or they consisted of cut up turkey. It would be prepared back over the hill in a mess tent. We used to get a quart of beer every night. It ended up that there was more beer than water, and so occasionally people without any water would shave in the beer. Most of the time we would be in our slit trenches looking out across the valley, but if you're in one of the reserve companies back here, about every third night you'd be on a patrol out in the valley out there. And the valley in front of us here, in front of 166 and down through the wider part of the Samichon, when we were up here in 187, that's where we did our patrolling.
All along the front, in an effort to seize the initiative from the Chinese, UN forces constantly patrol the narrow valleys between the front lines. Every night, men venture into the darkness, probing Chinese positions, never sure where or when the enemy would strike.
This is a very typical terrain that you would find on a patrol when you're coming down into the valley in towards the rice paddies. Getting ready for a patrol, we would start sometime in the late afternoon. You put camouflage paint or blackening on your running shoes. You put it on your face and you put it on the backs of your hands. After dark, we proceeded out towards the valley. We would come down through the minefield gap. Patrol probably would walk along a paddy bun like this, so they would have the protection of the paddy bun. And if something happened, you'd all go down on one knee, and the lieutenant would look out this way and to his front, and the second man, which would be myself, we'd look out to the front and this way, and the shotgun guard, who was also carrying a Sten gun, that was just a term for him, shotgun guard, he'd be behind here covering the rear. We would wait a while and listen and be very, very patient, because we knew the Chinese were very, very patient, and we would eventually move, but move very, very cautiously. The purpose of patrolling is you didn't want the Chinese to control the valley, because if they could control the valley, then they could control what they wanted to do in the positions. You don't fire on them, if at all possible, because if you fire on them, they can pinpoint your weapons firing. We never saw them. We heard them. They were like phantoms. On a reconnaissance patrol, I was the radio operator. I had a 300 set. Some of the men didn't mind patrolling. Some feared it very much and didn't want to leave the trenches. I volunteered, but I was still very much afraid. On this particular patrol, we moved out into the valley, and so Bands was in the lead with the sniper scope, and he would look through the sniper scope like this, and then he would move 2 or 3 feet or 4 feet, and he would look through it again and move it around to see if there's Chinese. As we were coming towards our second objective, we heard a Chinese patrol. We took the ground, called it fire from our artillery. You could smell the smoke off the exploding shells of cordite. You could hear the zing of shrapnel going over your head and some of it zipping through the grass. So what happened then is we moved on, and somewhere in the valley, whatever happened, I don't know, but the lieutenant stopped and turned to me and he said, "We're lost." We went up in the back of a hill. All of a sudden, somebody said, "Halt, who goes there?" Lieutenant, who was pretty strung out, said to him, "Young man, that's no way to challenge." And when he said that, the young man opened up with his machine gun. That was the end of the lessons on how to challenge. When you're in a routine, though, and you're getting shells and casualties, and they're light, and they're here and they're there, you don't think much of an attack. You think you're fairly safe, so that when it does come, it's a surprise.
In the early spring of 1953, the peace talks once again stalled. To improve their bargaining position, the Chinese increased their selective attacks on key UN positions. At the end of April, the second rotation of the RCRs had taken place, and the newly arrived 3rd Battalion was ordered to defend positions on and around Hill 187. 187 is a massive hill with many ridges that jut deep into no man's land, easy targets for the communist raids.
On 187, there was quite a bit of shelling all over the hills. Patrols were going out. There was nothing amiss, but the shelling intensified as the days got along. I didn't know whether something was going to happen or not until the patrol got hit out here. About 200, 300 yards out, they were ambushed by the Chinese. I was in a slit trench, and I started to fire the Bren gun. And then I saw the tracer bullets coming from over there at me. And I moved until only my hands were up over the parapet firing the Bren gun. The patrol from Able Company that went out that night, they found their way back, dribbled back. I don't know how many came back, but a good number of them came back, and they were down there when the bombardment came in.
The artillery attack on 187 on May 2nd was the heaviest bombardment on a Canadian position during the Korean War. But this was only a prelude to what was to come. On May 2nd, 1953, the Communists direct a devastating artillery attack on the RCR's positions on Hill 187. The Chinese target the exposed Canadian outpost deep in no man's land, but the RCRs are unaware that this is only the beginning.
I was told at the time that it was the heaviest bombardment in history for Canadian soldiers. Guys in the forward slopes, a lot of them were stunned, so when the Chinese, and wounded, so when the Chinese did come into the trenches there, they were not recovered from the bombardment. Brunt of the infantry attack came into 7 and 8 platoon down in the sharp end down there, and they got into the trenches of 7 platoon and some of the trenches of 8 platoon. And that's where they took the prisoners from. Took them across the valley. Right in the brunt of the attack, right, the 7th platoon down on the sharp end was Ed Hollier.
I could see that we were fighting a losing cause, and something had to be done to get the Chinese to back off. I requested that artillery be brought down on my position. When the barrage lifted, I went forward and found the position still overrun. The Chinese were everywhere. As we were passing a bunker, I was jumped by 3 Chinese. I dove over a sandbag wall and noticed a box of grenades in the corner. I started lobbing them at my oppressors. There was an explosion, a shout of pain, and then the Chinese took off.
After the battle was over, the Chinese had retreated. Trenches were down, and some soldiers got buried in the trenches, and 4 or 5 days later, they were carrying out the bodies of Canadians. Il-27 had the heaviest casualties of the Korean War for a Canadian unit in a short battle. There were about 80 casualties. 35 of those were KIAs or killed in action. We felt it was a raid, that they had come, and it was politically motivated to influence the peace talks at Panmunjom and the Americans about casualties. This type of thing happened. You look up and down the valley, you could see this happening 2 or 3 times a week with some company or someplace getting hit.
Throughout the summer of 1953, the Communists continued to launch a series of brutal attacks all along the front. But Canadian and UN forces hold the line. In July 1953, after 3 long years of fighting and over 1 million dead, both sides finally agreed to an armistice. And on July 27th, Canadians fired their last round of the war. For the Canadians, the war in Korea is over. 22,000 Canadians came to Korea to fight the Communists. 1,300 were wounded, and more than 300 lost their lives. The Canadians who died in Korea are buried in one place, the United Nations Cemetery at Busan. So Terry, the RCRs from 1953 are buried in 2 plots. I know there's a couple of them here. There's at least one in the back row, so we can check them out. See if we can find them over here.
Petty Redmond is from Halifax. He's probably the oldest soldier in Korea in the Canadian contingent who was killed. He was a very, very kind man, too kind to be a cook, actually. I was in the tent with Patty the day before he got killed, and I told Patty that I was going to Japan in maybe a month's time, and he pulled some yen out of his pocket, and he said, spend it on yourself. And the next day a mortar bomb came into the top of the tent, and he was killed, and there was about 7 people wounded, I think, or something like that. And there were tin cans and scattered for 150 feet, 200 feet over the sides of the hills. Morningstar was a veteran of a lot of action. He was on Hill 355 and other places, and we went on patrols together, and he was I was the radio operator and he was the shotgun guard. He was wounded and then in a trench, and he was evacuated about 1:30 in the morning by a little silver helicopter. And he died 10 or 11 days later in hospital. Doug Benton trained me. And I think of all the officers I met, I would admire him the most. When the patrol got hit on 187 out by the Saint-Michon River, he, in a second patrol, went to rescue the first patrol, and he got down as far as the minefield gap, and there was a lot of fire going on at that time, and everything was wild, and he shouted at them, come through me, and he raised his hands out, and he got hit and was gunned down in a minute or two, and in the end, they paid a great sacrifice that there's no greater sacrifice that any man can give you. Yeah, I pray for them. I prayed for them last night and this morning.
The first Canadians to arrive in Korea were the 2nd Battalion PPCLI, who earned their place in history with their incredible defense at Kapyong. One of these men was David Crook. The Kapyong guys, I think they're in that row over here. I want to have a look at them.
Hayes. No face there either. Carr I knew. He was Ricker's machine gunner. But he was killed up in D Company position. You always think it could have happened to you, but somehow it didn't. And you always say, Jesus, I'm glad I'm still here, and I'm glad I'm not there. You just feel so lucky to be alive, and you look at these poor guys who aren't so lucky, or weren't so lucky. They're still here. I guess that's the way I feel.
In the fall of 1951, Ed Mastronardi and his platoon from the 2nd RCRs defended the Sangok Spur from hundreds of Chinese attackers. Incredibly, during this action, only one of his men was killed. We'll look for compost grave. He's in this plot over here. I think he's in 3rd or 4th row, but we'll look down here.
Curry. Untold. Been a long time. Help me, O God, when death is near, to mock the haggard face of fear. And if I die, and die I must, my soul will triumph in the dust. You did a wonderful job. You saved a lot of our boys. And I'm sure you know that now. But you are. Got a lot of good company here, bro. A lot of good company here. And they're with you forever. But we haven't forgotten. And most of us are gone now. There was a Chunu. That's one of the few, if not the only one left. I will never forget you. And what you did. The song go. Soldier. Hero.
The Canadians who served in Korea should be justifiably proud of what they accomplished. We should never forget what our men did in Korea. But the peace they won is even today still fragile.